Hello, my name is Kristen McCune, and I'm an Education Programs Coordinator for King Conservation District. I'll be your presenter today. This presentation is being hosted by King Conservation District, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, we're really a unique type of government agency, a special purpose district similar to a water district or a sewer district, and we work with private landowners on natural resource protection in a completely non-regulatory capacity. We do this in three main ways. The first is through education. So we have events like this that are online or in video formats. We also host in-person workshops and tours throughout King County on a variety of natural resource topics. Today we're going to be talking about water and freshwater streams and lakes and wetlands, but we also have programming for those living on marine shorelines or farmers with livestock or growing crops. We kind of span the topics. We also have planners and folks who can provide technical assistance on those same topics that we also do education about. So we have forestry planners, we have farm planners, and we have shoreline planners who can help answer phone calls or emails if you have a specific question about your property. They might also be able to come out to your site and walk through your property with you and talk about some of your concerns and help build an actual management plan. We also have some financial incentives available. The Conservation District has a few different grant programs as well as a cost share program. So if there are certain practices that we're recommending you implement, we might have funding available to help you do that. There's a few other programs that the Conservation District offers, and I'll be mentioning those throughout the talk today. We live here in the Puget Sound Watershed, which basically just means that all waterways from the smallest unnamed creeks and ditches to our major water systems like the Duwamish River eventually flow into Puget Sound. And any actions that we do, especially if we're on one of those stream sides, but even in our other daily life around town, all have impacts on these waters. And the Conservation District, and we hope you as well, are really tasked with protecting these waterways. So that's what we're going to be covering today. Let's talk a little bit more in detail about some of these water features. First is streams, which are very important to our landscape here in the Pacific Northwest. They have three primary functions, which one is to move water from high up in the mountains to down lower. They also transport sediment during that movement. And then they provide a lot of habitat, both in the water itself and then nearby. We also have a lot of wetlands in our landscape, and they're this pretty unique and special feature. They act as a sponge and absorb heavy rainfall or water runoff, and then can actually filter some of those toxins. Rather than water running off really quickly, they hold on to it for a long period of time and can help recharge groundwater or slowly release it into some of our creeks. It's also a very important kind of niche habitat for a lot of different plant and animal species. In a natural system, our waterways have clean and clear water. So that means low temperatures, high amounts of oxygen, and then nutrients present. We also like to see aquatic organisms like the fish in this picture or insects or other aquatic organisms as well. There's also not a whole lot in this picture, but one thing that we like to see is some complexity in the stream. So that's presence of rocks or large woody debris and logs that are creating small pools where water might sit, and it can be shallow for younger fish to survive, or it can move more quickly and add oxygen to the system. Oops. So we call the land directly adjacent to the water a riparian zone, and Basically, this is just a band of plants that we like to see as being diverse, preferably native. And these plants provide a lot of shade to help moderate some of that water temperature, cover for habitat or food. Sometimes those leaves fall into the water. Sometimes insects sitting on top of the leaves will fall into the water and provide that base of the food system. And then this riparian zone, you might also hear us call it a buffer, and that's because it actually acts like a buffer of a last line of defense and protection against toxins and runoff and things that are trying to get into the waterway. They can pick up some of those toxins or slow the water down. In a natural system, we also like to see shorelines that have these amazing root structures. They function as excellent slope stabilizers. They're even better than engineered structures because they get stronger over time and can adapt as the land moves and changes. I want to show you just a brief overview video of our watersheds and how they've been changing over time.
Wherever you live on this earth, you live in a watershed. A watershed is a drainage basin, any area of the earth draining into a particular pond, river, or lake. The watershed of this pond, for instance, is the entire area of the earth that drains to the pond. The watershed of the pond and neighboring watersheds combine to form a larger watershed for this creek. The creek may then be part of a watershed of a small lake. It combines with other watersheds to make up the watershed of a larger river. That larger river feeds into an even larger river that has an even larger system of sub-watersheds. And finally, the ever-expanding system of watersheds becomes one huge watershed that empties into the ocean. But why should you care? From farms to small towns to cities, people's lives are connected by falling rain and flowing water, and where it goes. How you care for your land affects how much and how fast water flows to your neighbors downstream, and how clean that water is. And the way your upstream watershed neighbors care for their land affects you in the same way. For instance, if people upstream from you build houses, streets, and parking lots on the land that drains to your stream, you can expect more water to run off and at a faster pace, and your land is more likely to be flooded. Or upstream landowners who don't protect against soil erosion not only lose their soil, they dump sediment, nutrients, and other pollutants that affect everyone downstream. Without proper conservation, there are downstream consequences such as flooding, stream bank erosion, sediment-clogged lakes, and pollutants in drinking water. But those problems can be minimized if each of us does our part to hold the rain in place where it falls. We can help water soak into the soil by planting grasses, tilling the land less, using rain gardens, being careful of how much fertilizer we use, and doing many other things. But we each need to do our part. After all, we are all truly connected in a watershed, and we depend on one another to be a good neighbor.
So our watersheds have been changing and will continue to change over time. I want to show you this example of Renton. This first picture is in 1936, where you can see there's a lot of farmland and open space, a few roads and houses. But versus this picture from 2017, where there has just been an explosion of development and lots of new roofs and roads and things that are changing our water cycle. So now when that water lands, it's not just absorbing directly into the soil, but it's maybe running off a lot faster. It's picking up pollutants on its way and impacting the waterways nearby. Another common thing that we see in our urban environments is the presence of noxious weeds. In this picture, this is on Thornton Creek in Seattle, one of the projects that we did a couple years ago. On the left here, you see a lot of knotweed, and on the right, some blackberry. If you look closely in the back, there's some laurel and scotch broom. And then when we pulled all of this out, we found ivy underneath. So this site really had everything. And it's not uncommon to see in our urban sites. The goal is really to get to a place where we can keep some of the functions of our natural systems within the urban landscape. So I like this picture because it shows that we can have an urban environment that supports and protects something like a stream. We have that buffer of vegetation. It's allowing for a little bit of space for that stream to move a bit and meander. And while I think this stream could use a little bit more shade, I think they're doing a great job. Our streams and lakes and wetlands are a beautiful and pretty quintessential part of our Northwest ecosystem. And if you live along one of these waterways, you have this really unique opportunity to protect these special places and act as a last line of defense against some of these pressures by planting plants that provide habitat, shade, water filtration, and water slowing. And we can do all of this through a process that we call riparian restoration. The goal is to go from something like this giant blackberry bramble to something more like this, where there's a mixture of native plants that are going to protect our stream. And so for the rest of the class today, I'm going to go through what that process looks like, and then end with some plants that you might want to use on your own site. So Restoration 101. Let's start with invasive weeds. First you really want to start with identifying what weeds you have on your property. And from there you can understand what the best removal techniques are going to be. That's going to be dependent not only on the weed you're trying to battle, but also your site and location and your own personal abilities and desires. Here they're removing ivy on a very steep slope, so that was a big consideration. There's not a whole lot of equipment that can come into here, and it's steep and a little bit tricky for crews to get in there, so they had to consider all of these things before going in. I want to go over just a few of the common techniques for invasive weed management. First, we have manual removal, which is really just exactly as it sounds. You're using hand tools and just muscle to remove ivy, like what's being shown in the picture. You might be digging out a blackberry root with a shovel. You could just be peeling away morning glory vines off of a tree. All of those sorts of things are considered manual removal. Next is mechanical control. So this is a picture of me from a few years ago using a brush cutter. Basically just a heavy duty weed whacker, where we were mowing down some grasses that had kept popping back up around plants that we had planted a couple years ago. So mechanical control really is about that mowing and starving the roots, and can be really effective. Sometimes it can even be less invasive than manual control and actual digging. If you're worried about erosion or potential for soil to get into your stream, then this might be a good way to go. There can be some limitations based on what city jurisdiction you live in around using power tools near a stream and in that critical area zone. But this is a great option for control. This is sheet mulching. So we often use this after something like manual or mechanical control. Basically, you're just making it harder for plants to come back up. So this picture is showing using cardboard and then a thick layer of mulch over that. You might also use burlap sacks. Sometimes those can be easy to get from a local coffee roaster. They tend to have a lot left over. Burlap can be less effective than cardboard because there's holes in it, and so weeds can pop back through that. But both the cardboard and the burlap are nice because they'll decompose over time, in a couple years, once maybe some new plants have gotten established, and keep weeds at bay. There's also weed control fabric, which can work similarly to the sheet mulching technique. You're just keeping weeds from popping back up. And this is going to work well against those really aggressive weeds that might just pop right through something like cardboard. But this is a plastic material, and so you want to be conscious of that when you're using it, that you might be introducing plastic as it starts to break down a little bit, that could end up in your waterway. You also do have to remove it after a couple years once your other plants have established, and that can be a big job to do. So there is also chemical control, and we often use this as more of a last resort type of method, but it can be a valuable tool in your toolbox, especially if you're battling aggressive weeds like Japanese knotweed, where chemical control is really the only option. If you're going to be doing this near a waterway, then you need an aquatic approved license to apply it. And this is really where you want to bring in someone like the conservation district or another professional to help you do that. So shade is really going to be your best long-term option against most of our invasive weeds. You're trying to establish a more mature tree and forest type of canopy that's going to shade out any of those weeds. Most of our invasive weeds love open, disturbed sites. And so once you don't have that anymore, they're less likely to come back. But the reality is that weeds are hard to manage, and you're probably going to have to use a little bit of everything. There's no one right way. Usually takes multiple tries, multiple attempts, and some patience in there too. So we call this integrated pest management, where we're using a lot of different techniques. I want to dive into a couple common weeds in our region. First is English ivy. Unfortunately, this is one of those weeds that can thrive in shade. It likes to grow in our forests, especially our urban forests, and will end up growing vertically up the trees. It grows vertically because that's how it reproduces. If it's just growing flat on the ground, it won't produce any berries, but the second it starts to grow upwards, that's when you'll see it actually change its shape a little bit and start to produce berries that the birds really love and will spread farther away. So first off, you really want to just get it out of the trees. It can also be really damaging and eventually kill the trees. So we do what is called a ivy survival ring. Basically, you're just cutting around the tree and then around the base of the tree as well, and just removing that ivy that's trying to grow up. Once you've cut the root, then it's going to die. You can just leave that in the tree. It'll eventually die off and then fall out. It can be a little bit unsightly for the first year or two, but it's really important to not try and pull those vines out, because you risk pulling down a branch and causing damage to the tree or endangering yourself. If you have ivy on the ground, it's actually can be kind of fun to control because it rolls really well. The roots, as long as it hasn't been there for too long, can be pretty small and brittle. So you see in the left picture, a small amount, you can just bundle it up. Or on the right, we call this an ivy burrito, where you can work downhill, grab a few friends, cut off the roots right where it meets the dirt, and start rolling the whole thing downhill. Next is Himalayan Blackberry. We have a couple different types of blackberry in our area, Himalayan and Evergreen, which are invasive, and then we do have a native trailing blackberry, but you'll typically see that more along the ground rather than creating these giant monocultures like you see in this picture. Typically what we do to control this is first mow it down or cut it down in some capacity. And then depending on the size of your project or what kind of time you have, you can either dig up the roots and you need to dig that fairly deep make sure that you get the root ball. So blackberry has this massive storage of sugar that helps it survive for long periods of time. But you're searching for that giant root ball. Once you dig out that, then you're going to be a lot more successful. That might have to happen a few times. Another option is to just continually cut it for several years and starve that root. Or you can use herbicide. We typically use herbicide after you've cut it down from something like this so that you're not spraying so much of it. But you might cut just the canes that are left or spray those canes that are left. You could even paint on the herbicide on each of the canes sticking out of the ground to use the least amount of herbicide possible. Next is knotweed. So this is Japanese knotweed, and it's kind of a bamboo-like plant. It really likes to live along our streams and is great at growing quickly and aggressively. It has roots that grow rhizominously, so that means they grow right underneath the surface and can spread out far and then shoot up new plants farther downstream or farther out in your yard very easily. It's very important to never mow this plant, because what happens is as it, even a small segment of the plant, it can be a couple inches long, that can insert itself in the ground somewhere else and actually create a new plant. That's how hardy this plant is. Herbicide is really your best bet in controlling this plant. So if you have it, there are a lot of programs out there who want to help you control it. So please contact us and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction and get it figured out. The last two invasive weeds that I'll show you are English laurel and English holly. These are a little bit different because they're very woody. They're more like a tree. And then they have these very waxy leaves. So just spraying on an herbicide typically isn't going to work very well. Also, when you try to just cut it, typically a lot of stems will grow up from that one cut. So you're just creating even more of an eyesore and more of a hassle if you try to cut it down. There are herbicide injectors where you can actually insert just it's almost like a bullet of herbicide into the stem if it's a very big, if it's already become a tree. Or you could even just cut it down and then paint some herbicide directly on that fresh cut. Can work really well as also. So I want to show you a website that we use frequently, King County Noxious Weeds. I know I can't cover all of the potential weeds here in this workshop, but this is a great resource that I want to show you all. So this website it's been developed by King County and has really all the weeds that you could imagine. You can search by its common name, you can search by scientific name, or if you're not sure what the name of your weed is, you can just look for the color. When a plant is flowering is typically the easiest time to identify it. So it's best to wait, know what you're getting into, and then from there, you can actually control it properly. So I'm going to pick one of these and just show you. Let's go for tansy ragwort. So if you have this weed, or if you even think you might have this weed, you can go on this website, learn all about where it's distributed, how it grows, make sure you're identifying it correctly, learn about some of the history of it. And then what I want to show you is all of these weeds will have something called a best management practice file. And this is your resource for all things that you need to know about this weed. And one of the great things about it is that it has all of this information about how to control it, both manually, chemically, mechanically. This is where you're going to learn how to control your weed. We use this a lot. All right, let's go back to the presentation. All right, so Next, we're going to talk about erosion control. So this might be something that you consider in your restoration project if you live on a steep slope. The goal with erosion control is really to keep sediment out of the waterway because it acts as a pollutant, especially if it gets down to the bottom and settles in between the rocks. Where salmon like to lay their eggs is in a really rocky bottomed stream. When dirt fills that in, they're not able to lay their eggs correctly. So on the picture on the left, you see a erosion control fabric, which can work well for big areas. You can also plant directly into this. Sometimes we'll cut small holes into this fabric and then you can plant a plant in it. On the right, you see coir fabric or straw wattles, and these just slow water down. So you're putting them at an interval to keep water from picking up too much speed or too much sediment. If you're working on a really large, steep slope, that's typically a good time to call in a professional or call in the conservation district, and we'd be happy to help you come up with the right plan. Also, if you have a big slope, it's important to be realistic about the amount of work that you can accomplish over a season. So rather than clearing the blackberry from your entire slope so that it's all bare, it's best to work in small pieces at a time. So you can do 100 square feet this first year. Start with that, and then you can do more the next year so you're avoiding too much potential erosion. Next is the planting. So this is the fun part. And I want to empower you all to be a detective of your own property. So you are the expert because you live there and you see your property every day. And if you haven't noticed things like soil, light, and water on your property before, I encourage you to start that process now and make sure you really know your site before diving into a restoration project. So think about, is your soil rocky and well draining? Do you get a ton of sun in one particular spot? Is there anywhere where water pools and just sits? These things are all going to factor into what types of plants will thrive. And just some guidance on what common plant recommendations mean is full sun is really a minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight, all the way to full shade, which is less than 3 hours of direct sun. There aren't really many plants that can survive in 100% shade. They'll typically need at least a little bit of light each day. And then once you've thought through that, we like to create a map. So this was done online with an aerial image, but you can do it in whatever capacity works for you, even if it's just sketching it out on a napkin, that works just fine. So this person had a pond and was looking at doing a restoration project, and the ring right directly around the pond was wet and very sunny. Down below, it was dry with a mix of sun and shade, and over on the left, it was a dry and sunny site. So it's nice to break out your property in that way, because that can also give you some measurements, or at least rough measurements of what types of plants, how many you might need, and where they're going to go. Let's talk about a few of the different types of plant material that you might run into or might be interested in purchasing. And the first is potted plants, which can be great because they have high survival rates. They're easy to find, fairly easy to plant. If you are trying to create a certain aesthetic in your yard, they can be kind of nice because you can place them in a certain way and then maybe change your mind and move them around before you actually plant them in the ground. So you have a little bit more control that way. But these do tend to be the most expensive type of plant material. And if you're needing a lot of plants, they're not only going to cost you a lot of money, but they're going to be hard to transport. 100 potted plants won't fit in a traditional sedan. There are bare roots and plugs as a potential alternative. They're very inexpensive. Bare roots are basically exactly how it sounds. So there's no soil on the roots anymore. They are plucked out of the ground and they are shaken to get all the soil off, and then they're kept at a certain temperature, a cool, slightly moist temperature, so that the roots can survive. This is typically done when the plant's dormant, so December, January timeframe, which makes it a little bit more challenging to get them. They are only sold in February, March or so, but most conservation districts have a plant sale, and the King Conservation District has one every year in late February or early March. Pre-orders typically start in November, and you can get some of these plants for very inexpensive. They're easy to transport, they don't take up very much space, and can work really well if you're doing a larger restoration project. The other type of plant material that I'll mention is live stakes. These I really love because they just seem to work like magic. Basically, it's just a cutting of a plant. The plants that work best for this is red osier dogwood, our willow species, and cottonwood. So this, you take about a 3-foot segment of a branch, and then making sure it's still pointing up in the right direction, you stick it into the ground in another spot. These don't have as high of a survival rate as some of the other types of plant material, but if you already have some of these plants on your property, it's a really great way to just collect more future plantings without spending any money. And you also know that that particular plant is already adapted to your site, so the plant should work well. But they're also very inexpensive to buy. Really great for wet sites or right along the edge if you're looking for quick erosion control or something that's going to survive in those wet conditions. So we get this question a lot of when is the best time to plant, and it's really our winter wet season. So October through April is that perfect window. Typically we wait until we've had a couple rains in the fall, and then we know it's okay to plant when the ground is moist, and those plants will have the entire winter season to start establishing themselves before our traditionally dry summer happens. Containers, you can see, they work well anytime during that window. Stakes, it's best to start them a little bit earlier. You want them to start growing their roots before their buds start to break and they try growing leaves. And then bare root, as I mentioned, those really are only available a little bit later in the season, so you have to wait. So I want to highlight a few native plant all-stars. These more easily growing plants that we use in a lot of our restoration projects. I've broken them up into 3 segments based on how much moisture they like. So first we'll start with our moisture-loving plants, the ones that do well in really wet conditions. First is the western red cedar. So this is really an all-star kind of tree. It's known by some of the indigenous people of this area as the tree of life. And that's because they used it for just about everything, from building canoes to using it as diaper material to making baskets and clothing and different tools. This tree is also a restoration workhorse. Because it is an evergreen, it is going to be taking in water all throughout the year. So if you're looking for some of that stormwater runoff mitigation, this one will work really well. It can also do well in a little bit of shade and then wet conditions. If you have the space for it, I would highly recommend planting this tree. Next is red elderberry, and this is a shrub to kind of a small tree. It can grow fairly large for a shrub. It likes those moist and pretty shady areas. It does produce these beautiful red berries that are not great to eat raw, but you can process them and make them into a liqueur or a jam, and they're great. They're also very good for birds. Birds love them. Next is Pacific Ninebark. This one you can also put near the edge of a stream or a pond. It can take some of that flooding. It has these nice flowers and seed pods. And then what really makes it unique and stand out is this bark. This is where the name comes from. It doesn't actually have 9 different barks, but it kind of looks like it. And while this plant loses its leaves during the winter, the bark is interesting enough that it can provide a nice spot in your yard for looking at. Next is red osier dogwood. This typically prefers the more moist soil, but can grow in drier areas as well. This is one of those that you can use as a live stake. So if you have this already, feel free to cut off a branch and stick it in the ground and grow a new plant. They have some nice flowers, and then where this plant really shines is in the wintertime because it has this brilliant red to its bark. The more sun that it gets, the redder it's going to become. Here we have Sitka Willow, which is another tall shrub to small tree. It does well on the edges of streams and ponds. It grows very fast. If you're concerned particularly about erosion, this is a great one because you can plant it and its roots will establish very quickly and provide some of that benefit to you sooner. Here's a little catkin. Next we have dry loving plants. So starting with Serviceberry or Saskatoon. It's a really beautiful looking shrub. It has these nice white flowers and then has these very sweet and delicious berries. Birds love these. Here's Nikka Rose. This is a very robust and large growing rose. It spreads rhizominously, so it's not great for, say, the edge of a walkway or driveway because it'll start growing into that space. But it does work really well if you need any sort of natural barrier or fence because it does have thorns. So it keeps people or animals away. You can also hedge this pretty extensively. It's a hardy plant, so it'll grow back. So if you want it shaped in a certain way or cut back regularly, you can definitely do that with this plant. It also has these nice rose hips, makes great tea, good for you in the wintertime. Here's mock orange. This is another deciduous shrub, so it loses its leaves in the winter, but it comes out and then produces these beautiful white flowers that smell wonderful. It's great. This one's great near a walkway or where you can see it frequently. This is red flowering currant. It likes some kind of more drier, open areas and some sun. It produces these brilliant, beautiful flowers that hummingbirds love. Our office used to be directly next to 405, and we had a few red flowering currants where we would still see hummingbirds out there every day, even in the middle of this very loud concrete jungle of a place. We were still able to provide habitat with this plant. It grows in this nice shrub that can also be hedged depending on what your needs are. Here's tall Oregon grape. It likes those kind of drier, more open shapes. It also has these beautiful yellow flowers. This is a great one for erosion control or hedges as well. The last category of plants that I'll go through is our generalists. So like the plants that we just went through that are more like the koala that only specializes in eating eucalyptus, these next ones are more like the crow that eats just about everything. So these plants can grow in a variety of conditions and thrive. First is the vine maple, which is one of my favorites. This is a small tree, grows in the 15 to 20 foot range. And they're great if you don't quite have the space for one of our bigger evergreens. This one is just absolutely stunning. The leaves kind of fan out and then reach for the sun, and the more sun they get, the more brilliant their colors will be in the fall. And they just turn very orange and yellow and red, and it's wonderful. Here's their flowers. Next is Ossoberry, or Indian plum. We always say that this plant is really the sign of spring. It's one of the first plants to start producing leaves in the wintertime, so sometimes this comes out as early as February or early March, and is one bright spot of this brilliant, nice green when everything else is still kind of in its dormant stage. It does produce some actual plums. They're very small with a large pit inside, so you don't get a whole lot of flesh. They're also very hard to find because since they are the first of the season, the birds are really quick on these. Next is snowberry. So this is a beautiful plant that also can grow more like a hedge and can take over a space if you need it to do that. You cannot eat these berries, they're poisonous to us, but they do make an excellent food source for birds, especially in the winter. So after the leaves have fallen off, the berries are typically still there. So you have something late into the season that birds can eat. This is salal. It's kind of this nice, just green type of shrub. It's evergreen, so it's gonna stay green throughout the season. These nice, beautiful oval leaves that people have been using in flower bouquets a lot now because they just look good. They have these berries that are very sweet and delicious. I want to share with you another resource that we use, which is King County Go Native. The kind of the opposite website to what I showed you before on the invasive weeds. This is your resource for all things native plants. So let me pull up the website for you. And what you'll see here is that they have a lot of different categories. We're going to start with find a native plant and search for plants. So they have this great search function where you can put in the type of plant that you want. So let's say a tree. I want it to be evergreen, and I have moist conditions. You can get as detailed as you want. As you see, you can search for what type of wildlife it might attract to the color of its flowers. But for now, I'll just go with this one. And it's going to pull up a list of all the potential plants that might fit your criteria. Let's start with Douglas fir, because we didn't talk about that yet today. It'll give you some pictures and then just the general growing conditions and some descriptions about it. What you then can do is add this plant to your plant shopping cart. It's kind of like an Amazon shopping cart. You can't actually purchase plants through this, but it will save it for you, so you can just create a list. And then when you go to your list, you'll see all of the plants that you selected. And this is great to just print out and bring with you to, say, a nursery or wherever you're going to purchase your plants. The thing that I'll highlight is the Latin name, which is really key when you're buying plants. The common name can change or vary depending on where you're at. So if you really want a native plant, you want to look for it by its Latin name. I also want to show you another feature on this site, which is landscaping plans. So you can go through each individual plant and select that one by one. Or if you don't want to go through that process, you can just look up sample planting plans. Let's say I have a dry and shady site. And it has a potential map that you can use, and then also a whole list of plants that fit that criteria. And you can click on each of those. You could add those to your plant list, whatever you want to do. All right, let's get back to the presentation. I want to put in another plug for the King Conservation District's annual plant sale. So it's a pre-order system that starts typically in November. You order online and then pick up at our sale in Renton in late February or early March, whenever it happens. There are some plants available the day of, but I recommend getting your order in online beforehand. The really popular species do sell out, so it's important to start that early. This is a really inexpensive way to get a lot of plants, and it's kind of a fun event too, to go see us, talk with some of our planners, ask questions about plants. There are also several local nurseries throughout our area that sell native plants, but just like I mentioned, make sure you bring the scientific name with you. So after you've planted, you might want to consider adding mulch to add nutrients back into the soil and also retain moisture. It can also help a little bit with some weed suppression. And you want it pretty thick. We typically lay mulch in 4 to 6 inches. If you don't want to spread mulch over the whole of your planting project, you can also just do mulch donuts, just small little rings around each plant. I also want to point out on this picture, these blue tubes that you see, these are plant protectors. They're a plastic material, but you can reuse them if you were ever to do another planting project. And they just help the plant survive against both animal browse and then also humans as well. Sometimes our new plants are very small and they can be easy to get lost, especially as weeds start to pop back up. So sometimes we just use this for our own knowledge of where the plants are. If you're going to come back through this area with a weed eater or a brush cutter, then this way you won't accidentally knock off one of the new plants. And then steps 5 through really 105 is maintenance. Maybe not the most glamorous of the steps, but certainly the most important in your restoration project. The first 5 years are really the most important. And what you're doing through that process is you're monitoring and controlling any invasive weeds that are regrowing. You might replant some plants if survivorship falls below 80% or so. You might be replacing some of that mulch. You also might consider irrigation. So several years ago, we used to never recommend irrigation on our project sites. We would say, you know, if the plant doesn't survive, it doesn't survive. It wasn't meant to be there. But because our summers tend to get drier and longer, it's getting harder for plants to survive. So we do recommend irrigating if you're worried about it or if it's a particularly dry summer. It's not a frequent thing. It's maybe a couple times, 2 or 3 times over the summer, and you're watering very deeply. You want to encourage the roots to grow down deep rather than stay at the surface so that they can fend on their own. And with the right planning and maybe a few friends to help you out, you could start out with something like this. And then just 2 years later, already have these pretty well-established plants. We recognize that each landowner has challenges that vary from simple to complex, but KCD is really here as a resource to help match whatever goals you have with the environmental needs that we all have. We want to preserve and protect those functions of our streams and lakes and wetlands as much as possible. So grab your neighbors, friends, children, implement it on your own, or you can use the Conservation District. We do have programs for Streamside landowners to come out to your site, walk it with you, help develop a management plan, and then we do actually implement projects as well. We do about 20 of them every year, so your property might be eligible for that, so please reach out to us to learn more about that program. In the Puget Sound, we care a lot about our local coffee, our local craft beers, local artists, local musicians. But let's also think about the mighty native plant. We have an amazing array of native plants in our Puget Sound region, and they're as much a part of us and our culture as all of these other things. So I appreciate you taking the time to learn about how you can use these plants on your own landscape and protect our waterways and improve environmental conditions for all of us. We are here as a resource for you. I added this URL. If you're interested in having a planner contact you, please fill this out, or you can just visit our website and learn more about our programs. I wish you the best of luck, and thank you for taking the time to learn today.